better? Okay. We could talk all day about the impacts from nearly every industry that has ecological ramifications on our oceans, weather systems, etc. But we don't often think about are the changes to the migratory patterns of birds, the earlier or later bloom times of our flowering plants, or the vast green pollinator deserts that create habitat loss for most of the insect species when we create the ecological wastelands of lawns. Our backyards are places we find respite in, places we flee to when we need solitude or want to enjoy the natural world. How we behave and interact in this space and the relationship we have with it comes with some responsibility, especially now. The definition of ecological horticulture is the system of interactions between the garden and the environment that creates and maintains it. We aren't trying to turn back time, but we can help the flora and fauna that live here now deal with the rapidly changing conditions of the world for the future. A quick history of the American garden will help us understand why the conversation has moved to include natives in our garden. When you pass by a garden and admire it, know that the majority of the plants originate in foreign climates. Historically, the early Spanish settlers established orchards in Florida from Spanish seeds, and Jamestown colonists brought their own too. Early American gardening provided food and herbs in dooryard gardens for the kitchen. Slaves planted and tended many of these in our homesteads and plantations, creating the first gardens with surplus food and flowers to sell. But the affluent also planted ornamentals like boxwoods, snowballs, lilacs, and fruit orchards from seeds and plants brought over on ships. They didn't know what bounty awaited them in the New World, nor what they could count on, so they brought what they were used to. Fast forward 100 years, the first botanical garden in Philadelphia opened its doors for trading seeds. Hundreds of species of our North American species seeds were shipped to England in these trades. When Louisiana Purchase went through in 1803, a large influx of immigrants from Europe brought all types of seeds from their countries of origins, and the landmass that we call America doubled. So the flora we were able to familiarize ourselves with doubled too. Lewis and Clark had just come back from their cross-country expedition, detailing species and collecting seeds along the journey. The first seed exchange and store opened for their settlers. As the first produce markets opened in the 1800s, the home garden took a backseat and edible gardens fell out of favor. Ornamentals took center stage. Citizens moved out of crowded cities and built country estates with visions of grand planned terraces and ornate walking paths. US plant breeders focused on new garden varieties, and US researchers became known for their work on plant diseases and pests. By the end of the 1800s, home gardens expanded to sides and backyards. In 1878, the first mail order seed company was established, the Burpee Seed Company. How many people here have leafed through their catalogs? They're still in business today. Front door gardens were replaced by stylish, maintained grasses known as lawns. Victorians cut tapestry-like carpet bed designs into lawns and filled them with exotic flowers. Professional garden designers became an industry, and homes began to include distinct private areas protected from the public to enjoy. By the 1900s, trend-setting American garden designers used native plants previously considered too weed-like instead of new nursery cultivated varieties, but this didn't last very long because it was out of vogue in a flash as perennial English garden style became fashionable by 1910 and took over. But the lawns continued to grow in American landscape. Liberty Hyde Bailey of Cornell University created the word cultivar in 1923, defining it as the cultigen as a species or its equivalent that has appeared under domestication. The plant is cultigenous. During the war period, gardening took a right turn and patriots focused on victory gardens, growing food for their families in the war effort, with gardening for leisure dropping off the map. In 1949, the ecology movement was born with a book, A Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold. He was the first scientist willing to promote an ecological philosophy of living. He introduced the golden rule of ecology. Many people have never heard of him before. The key principle was unity and the interconnectedness of all things. This philosophy took the country by storm. It was a new idea and challenged the notion of eradicating predators as a right of the human species. After the war, resumption of garden culture and innovations in post-war technology attempted to simplify and improve home gardeners' yields. War chemicals were repurposed and packaged into new products such as insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, to give home gardeners the upper hand against pests and diseases. At the time, these were considered huge wins without much thought at all to the long-term effects or ramifications to the environment. The overuse of chemicals in organic fertilizers had serious environmental consequences, including polluting groundwater supply and reducing biodiversity. In 1962, biologist and conservationist Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, drew attention to the effect of these pesticides and pollution on the environment. And her book sparked the birth of the environmental movement. In 1970, the first Earth Day took place. And in 1973, the Endangered Species Act was established. People were waking up and they were wondering what was going on with our planet. In 2009, the White House planted its first vegetable garden since World War II. And in 2013, 1/3 of all American households reported growing food. Much like the dooryard gardens of early America, today's home gardens grow food and herbs, flowers, and native plants because people are very interested in all of these areas now. But due to climate crisis awareness, today we're working hard to restore ecosystem health through a movement called ecological horticulture. So how do we begin? First, we need to learn about the ecoregions of our nation and what grows in our area. The ecology of our region tells us how the plants here will behave and grow. North America has been divided into a broad mosaic of regions based on geology, soil, water, landforms, and land. There are 15 broad level 1 ecological regions broken down into 50 level 2 ecological regions intended to provide a more detailed description of these areas. And those 50 areas are broken down into 182 level 3 ecoregions. The level 3 gives us more specific defining characteristics and enhance environmental monitoring, assessment, and reporting. We live in the broader Eastern Temperate Forest ecoregion in the Western Allegheny Plateau, which you can see here on our map. Why do you suppose it's preferential to source plants from within your ecoregion as opposed to getting plants shipped from another ecoregion? Well, I'll tell you. The origins of the microbiome of soil matters, and we know that plants that originate from an ecoregion where they evolved suffer significantly less stress when they acclimate to our gardens. And stressed plants don't do well. What are known stressors? Transportation, hydration, pesticides, adaptation to new conditions, lack of nutrients in the soil, wildlife, and disease exposure. We know all of those are stressors on plants. According to the United Nations, half of all emerging plant diseases are spread through travel and trade. So being aware of the origination of your plant and asking our suppliers to be accountable is half of the battle. A seasoned gardener will ask before they buy. Where is this plant grown? Where did it originate from? Was it grown in this nursery? Is this plant from my ecoregion? Is it a local ecotype? Does it hold value for the local wildlife? Is this plant grown from seed? Is it a genetic clone? Is it sterile? Were pesticides used? Which ones? Is this plant safe for pollinators to use? What value does this plant have for the local wildlife? Notice I asked that twice. Is this a host plant for any pollinators? Remember, the less stress on the plant and the less unknowns you can rule out, the easier adaptation to your garden. It's your investment. And there's one big stressor that all organisms are facing: climate change. And it adds a whole new level of stress to plants and pollinators. Its impacts on biodiversity are being felt everywhere. Critical biological events such as spring budburst shifting and substantial range shifts of many species' migratory patterns are an evidence of the climatory stress we're seeing all over the globe. Rapidly changing climate data and warming over the last 30 years has forced the USDA zone maps permanently online for easier tracking and updating. Events such as droughts, floods, wildfires, and pest outbreaks associated with climate change disrupt and limit the capacity of ecosystems, such as forests, barrier beaches, and wetlands to continue to play important roles in reducing the impacts of extreme events on our infrastructure, our human communities, and other valued resources. How do you think these stressors impact your backyard? How do they impact you? Our ecosystem is interwoven and interconnected so that one change can alter the entire system. A food chain is a demonstration of the path in which the energy transfers from the primary producers, the plants, which is what we're talking about here today, all the way up to the top of the food chain, the animals, to support life. The plants are the foundation of our ecosystem. Without plants that the primary consumers can use, the ecosystem collapses or goes out of balance. In an intact ecosystem, pollinators help plants form seeds, creating another generation of genetic diversity. Insects who pollinate those plants provide a substantial food source for the birds and allow the next generation of birds to hatch. And the birds disperse seeds and are the pollinators themselves for the plants while fertilizing the soil with their droppings. It's a closed system. It seems very simple, divine even. And our task at hand as gardeners and as stewards of the planet is to recreate the basic ecological functions so diverse life can flourish in our backyards. We can recreate habitat today while meeting our need for respite and beauty that fills our bucket and takes care of the ecosystem at the same time, making space for them tomorrow too. Remember, the space isn't ours alone. Imagine what you can do with your garden by healing and restoring it. When you're recreating a garden ecosystem, it's very simple. Ecosystems are layered, three-dimensional systems. In order to protect diversity, we can recreate or mimic these in our gardens. What do you need? You need ground cover. This insulates and protects your soil microbiome. You need perennials. These can include herbs and root crops. Herbs are especially useful because they help protect plants from pests. You need shrubs to provide habitat and blooms, and vines for the same reason. You need a water source for your insects. And you also need a water source to enjoy the beautiful sounds of water for your own pleasure. You need an understory and a canopy. You need leaf litter and organic material to break down into humus to feed all of the plant life in your garden. That's it. Most spaces have some of these aspects of a functional ecosystem, but most don't have it all. So your job is to build it back. I hate to say it, build it back better. Okay. As you may well be aware, plants have traits that make them desirable to pollinators that use them for their life cycle. Consider these traits of a plant from a pollinator's point of view. These traits make them interesting to people too. Pollination syndromes are traits of the reproductive parts of plants or the flowers to predict the type of pollinator that will visit or use it. These guides are helpful for planning diversity of plantings as well. Look at this chart and you can see how different pollinators need differing sources of pollen and nectar from lots of differing kinds of flower shapes and colors. As you can see, butterflies are attracted to different colors and shapes of flowers and nectar, and those needs are very different than bats or than beetles. So it's important to build diversity into the ecosystem that you're planting. Don't plant all coneflowers. That's not good for your ecosystem. That's a monoculture. You want diversity and wealth in your garden. Do you know that pollinators are responsible for every third bite we take? Something like 70 of the top 100 plants humans use for food rely on the pollination of bees and birds in order to reproduce. We simply would not have a food supply if it weren't for pollinators. 80% of all flowering plants on Earth depend on pollinators for reproduction. We need pollinators. Half of the world's oils, fibers, and raw materials are because of pollinators. Pollinators help prevent soil erosion. Pollinators help increase carbon sequestration. Pennsylvania alone has an estimated 8,000 species of terrestrial insects and records for 437 species of bees, only 23 of which are exotic. In addition to the bees, Pennsylvania has records for 1,700 species of moths. That's our local ecosystem. The 2015 Pennsylvania State Wildlife Action Plan lists 3 species of bees, 51 species of butterflies, and 111 species of moths as species of greatest conservation need. So there's a lot of habitat loss, and there are a lot of species that need our help. Different pollinators that live in our ecosystem are beetles, flies, wasps, hoverflies, butterflies, moths, bees, ants, mosquitoes, birds, bats, and rodents. Other ecosystems include monkeys and lemurs, marsupials, and lizards in island ecosystems. We don't have the fortune of having those here, but they're very important all over the world. And pollinators have been declining globally. In North America, we have a big problem losing our bumblebees. And the big reason for pollinator decline is multifaceted. Habitat loss and degradation is number one. Invasive plant species that outcompete native wildflowers is number two. Overabundant deer grazing of wildflowers is number three. Artificial outdoor lighting that attracts moths to the lights at night instead of moths going to pollinating plants seems to be number four. And the overuse and inappropriate use of pesticides is number five. And number six is climate change. A lot of that is stuff we can control. Generalists are pollinators that can make use of a variety of plant pollens and nectar from many sources. You'll see these guys fluttering around all over the place, and they will go to anything that they can find that has pollen or nectar. But specialists are the guys we need to protect. Specialists are pollinators that can only thrive in a narrow range of environmental conditions, and they have limited diets. I've included this tangle-veined fly because he's pretty cool. He has a very long proboscis. It is so long that he can only drink nectar out of a very, very long, narrow flower. And if that flower goes away, he goes away. But there are many specialist bees in our ecosystem, and there are many keystone plants or specialized plants that fit these specialized species that we have in our ecosystem. There are three types of specialist bees here that I included so that you could learn about them. The most specialist and the one that is the most difficult to protect is called the monolectic species. They have the most restricted floral requirements. They feed on only one plant species, even when there are others of the same genus around. There's the oligolectic species, where they gather pollen from 2 or several species of one plant family. And there's the polylectic species. They're more generalist. They will gather from lots of kinds of flowers from one plant family. But our keystone plant species are these plants that marry the specialist pollinators. And we have several in our ecosystem that are super special here in Pennsylvania. We have goldenrod, we have aster, we have sunflower, and coneflower, all of which take care of these specialist bees, and a lot of other specialist pollinators as well. A keystone species is one in which other species depend in an ecosystem. If it vanishes, that specialist species vanishes as well. Now I'm telling you about all of this because our natives are the most important part of our local ecosystem. Now, what is a native? The definition of a native is something that there's actually a lot of disagreement about because of changing conditions with climate. People argue, well, what is a native? Aren't habitats changing? Aren't birds moving around? Can't things adapt? So I'm giving you 4 definitions. You ready? The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center says that a native is one that exists in a given region through non-human introduction, directly or indirectly. The US Forest Service says all indigenous terrestrial and aquatic plant species that evolve naturally in an ecosystem is a native. The Wild Ones Foundation, which is a foundation that specializes in promoting natives, says that native plants are those that evolve naturally in North America. More specifically, native plants, in a particular area, are those that were growing naturally in the area before humans introduced plants from distant places. In Eastern and Central North America, native plants typically grew in communities with species adapted to similar soil, moisture, and weather conditions. Some of the widespread communities included oak, hickory, chestnut, and beech maple forests, tall grass and short grass prairies, and freshwater marshes. Additional communities occupied specialized niches, including savannas, fens, bogs, floodplains, and alpine areas. So there's a lot of definitions for what a native really is and how specific that definition needs to be. Ecologically speaking, natives really provide a hugely important role in supporting the growth and development of our native insect populations. Insects are incredibly important as they bridge the energy flow between our producers and our consumers, and they allow humans to eat, they allow all the animals to eat. They're the closed loop between the plants and the animals. And we really need our native species in order for the insects to eat and produce food for the birds and for other animals that eventually lead up to feeding us, right? Other aspects of natives. Native plants are adapted to our local soils, climate, and conditions, and will persist through frost and drought. Native plants provide seeds, insects, and caterpillars. A planting of natives will attract native pollinators, such as native bees, butterflies, moths, beetles, and hummingbirds. And native plants require less maintenance, such as water and soil amendments. They require almost nothing when they're established. There are approximately 2,100 native plant species in Pennsylvania. And as you can see in this picture, natives grow immense root systems and help with erosion as opposed to non-native species, which is pretty important as we're getting a lot more rain and a lot more storms, which is washing away our soil. So there's a lot of reasons that natives are great. And I could talk to you about that all day. And I've bookmarked 2 pages talking about all the fabulous attributes of natives in these 2 books that you're welcome to look at after my presentation. Now, I have some natives over here that I purchased today that you can look at with some little plant labels that came from the nursery, and you can look at those to see the difference between those and these, which are Nativars. A Nativar is a cultivated variety of a native plant that is bred or hybridized for desired characteristics. Its name will fool you. It is a cultivar. It is a cultivated plant. It has some similarities with the native, but it is designed by people for our benefit, not for the native's benefits, not for the insects' benefits, not for the soil. It is because there's something about the plant that we wanted to capture or enhance or make better. If we ask these questions, how do we suppose altering the height, the leaf color, the vigor, or the compactness of a native plant might change the way it interacts with other species in its habitat? You might wonder about these plants in front of you. In the early 2000s, Dr. Alan Armitage coined the term nativar to refer to the cultivated varieties of native plants. It is better than saying cultivar of a native plant, but it does leave the impression that it is a better or a good ecological substitute for native plant, and it isn't. It is a dangerous situation and it misinforms consumers. We know that non-native plants have greatly reduced ecological roles when compared to their native counterparts. They do not support the growth and development of native insect populations in the same way as our native plants. Some pollinators travel long distances, with migratory pollinators being extreme examples of this. Some plants are wind pollinated and their pollen is carried for miles. Parking lots and highways do not discourage wind-borne pollen. Seed carried by wind and water or birds make the pollen from plants go very, very long distances. Once the DNA from a cultivar of a native plant or a nativar makes it into the wild population, there is no way to dispose of it. The new DNA affects the ability of a wild plant to survive and has ramifications for all of the species that interact with it, including the native plants. Studies have shown that in some cases, cross-pollination with cultivated varieties have resulted in the complete loss of the wild relative. The literature shows that many wild plants have been genetically replaced by these domesticated varieties. So by altering the DNA of native plants to change their height, their leaf or their blossom color, petal shape, or their number, their disease susceptibility, can these plants offer value to our ecosystem enough that we're upsetting the balance in ways that we don't know enough about? Are they better alternatives for our ecosystem than natives? The question is, we don't know yet. We don't know enough about the long-term impacts of frankenfood, basically, franken plants, plants that we are messing with genetically and putting back into our ecosystem. There are cultivars that are sterile, and those ones are not putting their pollen back into the ecosystem. A good example of this would be all of the cultivars of our native hydrangea. There are many of those in our neighborhoods, and those plants are sterile. Their pollen is not going out into our community. They're beautiful, and they are providing habitat for our pollinators to lay eggs and to reproduce on, but they're not providing any food. So those have been cultivated long enough, and they're considered cultivars, not even nativars, because they've been cultivated to be different shapes and sizes and colors over time that they are now considered part of our cultivated plants in the nursery, and they don't impact the ecosystem in a negative way that is unknown. We know that they're sterile, but they aren't providing food. All they're doing is providing beautiful things for people, and they do provide some habitat. And there are other plants that we're starting to see changes with, like the Bedelia bush, which we know is an aggressive non-native that reseeds itself like crazy, and also provides tons and tons of pollen that the butterflies adore. But the problem is the butterflies flock to it and then ignore the native plants to the detriment of native reproduction of native plants. They just don't reproduce if they don't get pollinated. So now they're working on a sterile cultivar of the Bedelia bush that will not reseed itself, and the pollen will all be sterile so that it will not reseed ever, and we'll still have these beautiful cultivars of the Bedelia bush. One moment. So we also know that with these cultivars, the nativars of these beautiful natives, when they are changed to appeal to the human eye, some of them produce double petals, which are really just for us to enjoy. The pollinators can't use those at all. They can't get their proboscis down into the center of the flower to get any nectar at all. They are completely useless as a food plant for pollinators. They're beautiful, but they're absolutely not useful at all for our pollinator plants. So we know that there's a huge interest in more plants that support our ecosystem, and more science is being done. But the rub is we just don't know enough to support using nativars as a primary piece of our garden. We want to make our gardens more and more supportive of our ecosystem, which means we need to support our ecosystem with more natives and try to just put these in as garnish. Garnish your garden with beautiful things, but make your garden's primary food source be natives. I want to mention neonicotinoids real quick, because our nurseries are using neonicotinoids to keep the chewing bugs off of their plants. And they have a lot of reasons for doing this. They want to make sure that the produce that they make their money off of doesn't get destroyed in the nursery. Makes total sense, except that they're also spraying the plants that are supposed to be of value for our pollinators. And neonicotinoids are to control sucking and chewing insects like beetles, whitefly, Japanese beetles, emerald ash borer, and others. But some of the insects that they get are important pollinators like honeybees and bumblebees and solitary bees, and our monarchs, because our monarch caterpillars are chewers. Unfortunately, research suggests if you treat plants using these neonicotinoids and any of our pollinator caterpillars get to this plant at all, and any of the chemical residue is left on these plants, which by the way does not come off with a blast from the hose, these pollinators will all die. And this neonicotinoid is thought to be responsible for hive death now. So a lot of companies are trying to ban it. A lot of the big box stores are saying that they no longer carry plants with neonicotinoids, but there are many that still have these labels. Many of them still have this. In fact, in our family, we were given some butterfly weed when we moved into our house. My children were littler. We were very excited. Monarchs came, they laid eggs. We watched the cycle of life with the monarchs, and the caterpillars all died. We didn't know what happened. We talked to our friend who gave us the plants. They had purchased them at a big box store. They had been treated by neonicotinoids. So the neonicotinoids are a dangerous substance. There's no reason that they should be spraying them on plants that are supposed to support wildlife. Again, with the questions, you need to ask the questions. What are these plants? Have they been sprayed? Where do they come from? Do they support wildlife? It's our job as consumers to put pressure on our nurseries to ask the questions, or these things don't change. All right, a cultivar is a plant that has been intentionally produced by selective breeding. It is a plant that has a patent on it, that the garden center has an ownership of. It exists only because of human intervention, and its continued existence relies on human involvement. Many of them are true to type clones. Many cultivars are propagated vegetatively through cuttings, grafting, or tissue culture. If you try to grow a plant from a seed from one of these, it does not grow true to type. It's not a cultivar if you try to grow it from seed. Cultivars are not only created by humans, but they must be maintained by them intensively. So there's some issues with these. They don't meet the needs of native pollinators. Most of them are sterile. They don't produce seeds. They don't produce pollen naturally because they can't reproduce on their own. They're human managed, beautiful things to put in your garden. Most of them are annuals, but they are just for us. So what value do they hold in our ecosystem? Again, they're okay if they're sterile and they're not adding their DNA to our pool in our ecosystem. But again, they're garnish. Your garden should not be filled with this. This would be damaging to your ecosystem to have even a little bit of DNA from these plants, from the ones that are not sterile, entering our ecosystem and changing our ecosystem in unknown ways. So what can we do? The first thing, if you've taken any classes from me before, you know that soil is my favorite thing. It is the living skin of our planet. It's the basis for healthy, robust, disease-free plants and animals. First, take care of your soil, improve your soil. That's the first and best thing you can do for your garden. Revitalizing your soil food web is the best way to make the space healthy for you, your family, and the ecosystem. Then, work towards 70% native species in your space. This is the best way to revitalize the ecosystem. The very best way to invite back the ecosystem that actually belongs there, because it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to every creature that lives here. When we moved into our house, we had front lawns and our moving truck was late. My poor husband, I flipped the front lawn in that first week because I had nothing to do and I had no furniture. And now we have a vibrant ecosystem and we have all the pollinators on my block in my front yard. And all my neighbors are flipping their lawns because they would like to have beautiful pollinating plants and pollinators too. We have all the hummingbirds in the neighborhood in my garden. It's a wonderful thing to see what happens when an ecosystem is revitalized and when the creatures that belong there are actually there. It's pretty cool. It's wonderful. Ask your nurseries if they carry natives. Ask them to start carrying specific plants for you. Don't be shy. Ask. It's our job as consumers. If we don't ask, they don't know. And they're going to keep carrying junk or plants that are sprayed or things we don't want. Remember, there's only a market because people buy it. And start or join your own native plant buyer groups. These are really easy to form. Get together with your friends, grow some things together, grab some more people, pool your resources and grow some things that you want to grow. Why not? See what you like. See what grows in your area that you enjoy. Take some walks in your neighborhood and say, I want some of that. I'm going to knock on the door and see if they have some seeds. I mean, you can. I have. Enjoy sterile, non-invasive cultivars and nativars that benefit wildlife as garnish. I'm not a purist. I have some nativars. I just bought some to show you guys. My daughter was like, why did you do this? We have these in our garden. said, I can't dig them up for our class. I had to go to the nursery. Come on. So I do believe that you can have joy in your space. It's okay to not be a purist and to have things that are not native, but you really do need to improve your percentages and try to get up to at least 70% to support your local ecosystem. Also, plant for succession blooming. You want to have plants that bloom early spring, early summer, late summer, and fall. And if you're a vegetable farmer, you can grow things even in the winter here. There are ways to do it. It's not that hard. We have beautiful long seasons here. And remove invasives from your garden and from your local parks. Help improve the ecosystem all around you. It's your job. You're a gardener. You can do this. And we can all improve our spaces and help our neighbors. I'm helping a guy down the street rip out English ivy. It's hard for him. I'm doing it for fun. And it will help the ecosystem by getting it out of there and putting in some natives and teaching him about his soil. Support your local natives nurseries. There are natives nurseries around here. There's several. One I really like is Arcadia Natives. The woman who owns it, Kelly Strobe, has run her nursery for 2 years. She's really invested in helping restore our ecosystem and teaching people about natives. So if you look her up or you go over there, she'll tell you a lot of different things. I actually have her business card over here on the table. You guys can pass it around if you're interested in her information. And also, there's this incredible movement that is super important called the Homegrown National Park. And I want to tell you guys about this really quickly as we wrap up. Homegrown National Park is a movement created actually by Doug Tallamy. And I have 2 of his books here. You can see them on the table. Doug Tallamy is a leader in the movement to restore ecosystems. He's an American entomologist, ecologist, and conservationist. He advocates for home gardens that bridge the gaps between parks and preserves and provides habitats for native species. In the past, we've asked for one thing of our gardens, and that they be pretty. Now we're asking that they support life, sequester carbon, feed pollinators, and manage water. Homegrown National Park is asking you to plant natives and get your garden on the map. We have an interactive digital map where you can put your garden on the map in the United States. And what we want is to have enough land connected so that wild species, pollinators, birds, and terrestrial mammals and animals have space to wander. I believe the goal is 20 million acres. The initial goal is 20 million acres of native plantings in the US. This represents half of the green lawns of privately owned properties. We're trying to increase our natives and trying to restore ecosystems, and in a hurry, because the more soil we revive and the more natives we plant, the sooner we can save our planet, the more animals we can provide ecosystems for and homes for, and the more people will enjoy their spaces. I'm telling you, it's way more fun to look at my garden than the lawn next door. So, whether you've learned something new today about the history of gardening in America, the Homegrown National Park, our local pollinators, native plants, or cultivars, I hope that I can appeal to you to consider this do no evil approach to gardening we're embracing as an industry, hobby, and as enthusiasts of our planet. Sustainability in gardening today and in the next 20 years, we're attempting to enhance your garden, the soil, and our ecosystem. We are trying to support, preserve, keep alive, maintain, reinforce, and nourish our ecosystem, our gardeners, our education about the soil and the planet. We're trying to promote good environmental stewardship, make educated decisions about what you buy, and support sustainable and responsible products and practices as much as possible. And ask questions of your local gardening professionals and industry. Demand activism. There's no reason not to. None of us has to sit by and say, oh, but they only had this crap plant. No, no, no. Ask for what you want. Even ask Home Depot. I promise you that guy will go to his manager and say, man, 10 people asked me today for a native plant. Maybe we should have some natives. It matters. Thank you all for coming to my course today. Does anyone have a question? Any questions? Yes.
How do you feel about planting native flowers along interstate highways?
I feel great about that. I think that's a fantastic idea. I think we should plant native flowers everywhere. Because why not? I think
America beautiful.
Yes. And I love driving on the highway, especially if I get stuck in traffic.
There's all the pollution from the cars. And you know, if the flowers attract birds, then pollinators, then the pollinators exposed to all that bad air.
Well, think about it this way. Even 20 years ago, when you drove down the road, there were all kinds of bees and bugs and all kinds of stuff sticking to your windshield that don't exist today. And they don't exist today because of a variety of things, but mostly pesticides. So planting plants that attract pollinators and bring back species that are almost wiped out isn't a bad thing. All it does is make people go to the car wash. And that's not a bad thing either, right? I mean, I think what we have to do is think about what's lost. If you read books about our country, when Lewis and Clark explored, and even after that, when the West was being settled, when people were going across the Oregon Trail, our country was filled with life, and we have wiped it out. And we need to restore habitat, not think of it as ours. It's not ours. It's ours to share. And the more birds, the more bees, the more hoverflies and butterflies, the better. I mean, it's a perfect space to plant flowers. It's a perfect space to plant the tall wildflowers that are difficult to put in a backyard space or a front yard space, because there's some that are wild and unruly that are a little bit difficult to put in a planned garden. As a garden coach, I'm often designing, and I have to think about what grasses work in a small space. Some of them are just too large. That's a perfect space for tall grasses, for birds to come and sit upon and eat the grass heads. Right? Those birds are not going to fly into windshields. They're smarter than that.
So how do you classify forsythias? Are they cultivars? Forsythia bushes get a lot of flowers, and they have plenty of them in Monroe. Forsythias.
How do I classify forsythia? Forsythia is non-native, but it is naturalized, meaning it's been here a long time. And it doesn't make it bad. It means it's been here a long time and it has some value because it does provide pollen for a lot of pollinators, and it is quite a beautiful plant, but it outcompetes native plants. So while I love forsythia, especially as a West Coast native where it doesn't grow, it's definitely an East Coast special plant. I would say don't plant it, plant natives, because the natives are struggling to get the pollination and the reproduction because it's competing with naturalized non-native plants like Bedelia, like forsythia, like lilac, and others that are here that don't belong in our ecosystem. They did not evolve here, that pollinators use because they are smelly and delicious. They're the McDonald's plants, right? They're the ones that they go, ooh, this is so easy and yummy, but they don't live here. So they pass over the natives that actually live here to go to those plants and use that. Young woman in the jeans jacket had a question.
Yeah, I love the Queen Anne's laces now. I was up in the mountains this weekend and last week, and it's all. Is that a native?
Yes, we have native. Yes, we have native. But you have to be careful because there are a couple lookalikes that are quite poisonous, like poison hemlock. Poison hemlock and Queen's lace are very much alike. So be very careful if you plan on picking any. Poison hemlock looks almost exactly alike, except its stem has purple polka dots. And if you pick it, you can get a splitting rash where it actually splits your skin. And it is horrible, nasty stuff. If you happen upon poison hemlock, you're actually supposed to report it to the state and never touch it. You're supposed to use gloves and wear a mask when removing it. Yes, it's also native. Purple dots, look it up, but it looks almost exact. Yeah, it's super dangerous. And there was a whole bunch last I saw in Upper St. Clair in the park. It grows native and grows on the side of the road, but you just have to be very careful not to touch it. Yeah. Any other questions? Any Zoom
Miriam.
questions? I can't see you, Zoom, but I can hear you.
Miriam, there's a question in the chat.
Okay.
It's what was the name of the natives nursery that you recommended?
Arcadia Natives. It's in Washington, and the owner is Kelly Strope. She's lovely, she's educated, and she's running a very, very well-oiled machine out there. I highly recommend Arcadia Natives. Yeah.
Plants that you have here, are these examples of non-native?
Yes, so these are cultivar echinacea, coneflower, and I brought them in because I wanted you to see that echinacea is a plant we all love. It's a beautiful flat disc plant with big blossoms, big petals. The native is here, which is purple with the big orangey center. I actually picked this from in front of the library, and it's tall. The native is quite tall. They've made a cultivar that retains all of the native's properties, except it's shorter. Now, in that sense, retaining all of its natural properties except its height makes it safe for pollinators because it still has the ability for pollinators to get their proboscis down in for pollen. It doesn't have changed genes for disease resistance. The only difference is the height of the plant. So in that case, that would be an okay nativar to select. But as a consumer, you don't really know if they've messed with the genes in any other way. With these, you can really tell because you can see that they are different colors. Some of them have slightly different blossom shapes. I didn't grab any double blossoms or triple blossom shapes because I can't morally put those in my garden at all. But I wanted to just show you what some of the different colors are. And in fact, there are some studies that show that the pollinators will avoid some of the colors in different studies of nativars because they think that the colors have poisons in them that they would have in nature. So like with ninebark, for example, ninebark is a shrub. They have cultivars of ninebark where the ninebark is green, naturally, the native, but they have made cultivars of ninebark that are chartreuse and one that is a deep burgundy. And the caterpillar pollinator that they brought to the study would not touch the red cultivar at all, because of the chemical components that are normally in red leaves in native plants. They just wouldn't touch them, but they would eat the lighter green and the regular green plants. Now, they're avoiding those out in nature, even though they're all supposed to retain the same genes other than the color, and they're all nativars. But we just don't know enough yet about messing with the genes of plants, especially ones that are not sterile, and putting them out into the ecosystem. Yes?
Is Rose of Sharon native? Because I have a lot of it, and the bees and the butterflies are always on it. Not really?
So Rose of Sharon is an invasive and non-native, and you should rip it all out. That is my feeling. And rip it out as soon as it comes up, because if you let it grow, it's much harder to take out. Yeah, that's how I feel about that one.
The bees, the butterflies,
they do, because it's a McDonald's. I'm telling you. Anyway, I'm sorry for anyone who works or owns a McDonald's. I'm so sorry, but it is not a good thing for your ecosystem to have a McDonald's in it.
So question.
Yes.
So any roses of Sharon is not a native?
Not native, correct.
Yeah,
there are mallow plants that are native, which is the same family, but not the Rose of Sharon. I'm sorry to tell you. Does anyone else have any more questions? One more.
Churchill, the green space in Churchill, what do they call that now? Where the country club used to be.
Greenway.
The Greenway. Yeah. Is there an effort to do some kind of ecological design there?
I don't know.
At Turtle Creek, we mentioned Turtle Creek.
Oh, I will ask Rhea Homa, who is a good friend of mine.
They had a field trip there.
Oh, okay.
The other question is, quickly, is there anyone in the government of Monroe that's aware of anything like this? Because they have a master gardener on staff in Monroeville.
No.
Parks and Recreation doesn't have a master gardener. No. Oh, they all have volunteers. Yeah, maintain that Peace Park over there. That's right. They all bunch of rummies.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming to my program today. Thank you.